So when we, have been talking about the spinal reflexes in general, what's been going on with the nervous system, right? We had some kind of sensory input and there was some sort of integration within the central nervous system right here, right, with an interneuron. And then there was a motor output, right, causing this response, right? So in this example, person sees a glass of water, that sensory information enters their eye, goes in their brain and does magical things. And then they go and reach for the glass of water and drink it, right? So that would be like kind of thinking of it like sensory integration, output, right? But really today we're really all about this integration, right? The high level stuff that says, why are you looking at that glass of water in the first place? How do you recognize it as a glass of water? Are you really thirsty or not? Right? Do you think there's a bug in it, right? Or do you think like you want to give that water to someone else? Or do you think it's nasty tasting something? So all this other stuff is going to be going on before you decide to actually drink it, right? So, this is all the function of the higher levels of the brain, right? So to understand your brain structure, really, this is what I kind of did all my years of research in, which is brain development. It's kind of a simple way to understand the organization of the brain, that you start off like a tube, right? Think of like a garden hose, right? Filled with water. The garden hose wall was like the neural tissue. And then the inside here was this fluid filled space over there. And then you started to get these constrictions in the anterior region of it. And they started to kind of blow up, right? The tissue expanded and then started to kind of form these structures, right? And for each of these little regions over here of this neural tube, right, they became the adult brain structures eventually, right? So a couple of these words, we'll use certainly the diencephalon. That's a embryonic kind of structure. And we use it because it encompasses a couple of like thalamus, hypothalamus that we talk about very separately. Telencephalon, we could kind of interchange with cerebrum. Over here, mesencephalon, we'll usually use midbrain, and we barely use this meta and myencephalon, but those are the embryonic regions that these adult brain structures gave rise to. And sometimes you will see things like mesencephalic aqueduct or mesolimbic pathways, right, to denote like connections from the midbrain over. So it's good to kind of at least be semi-familiar with it. And there's an easy way to remember that. And that mesencephalon, S, T, and Y, it's alphabetical order from anterior to posterior, if you ever wanted to remember anything. But these are the adult brain structures they gave rise to. So, so during development, you start off with this tube, and then again, some areas, especially anteriorly, start to go crazy. And like, if you were a fish or a frog or something, you kind of stop around this stage right here. And your, mesencephalon and metencephalon would be about as big as your telencephalon. Whereas in mammals and in primates and in very particular humans, right, this whole telencephalon areas, the cerebrum goes crazy. It just starts expanding like mad to form your cerebrum, right? To form all this crazy brain structure that'll give us all our neural computing power that makes us so damn smart. Right, so this is what happens during development, right? And this nice early simple tube where you had anterior, posterior gets all convoluted, so that now you have like, this is kind of anterior, this is posterior, but it's not quite the same as anterior, posterior, dorsal, ventral, and the spinal cord because of the way it curves around. But in any case, these are the adult brain structures. This is how your brain develops. Right. So the adult brain, and when I'm giving you different views of them, just keep note of the view I'm giving you, keep kind of tabs, and also get used to looking at understanding what, I mean, inferior, superior seems pretty simple, but there's also like cut sectional planes you want to get used to looking at. So just pay attention to the views we're looking at here. So it's looking up from the bottom, right? An inferior view. And from that view, this is the spinal cord, which we talked about, which would be in the vertebral column. And then as it enters your foramen magnum, it becomes the brainstem, which would include the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain, right from here to here. And then in the back of the brainstem right here is the little brain, the cerebellum, back over here on the posterior side. And then the big brain, what you think of as a brain, is your cerebrum, right? This wrinkly structure. And so that's you looking at it from an inferior view. And this is a sagittal view of the whole body, right? A cadaver section, where you can see the brain still inside the skull with the associated features. And again, the spinal cord down the vertebral column enters the foramen magnum, becomes the brainstem in red right here. And this is the cerebellum sitting behind it. Again, this is the foramen magnum pieces right here where it enters. Again, this is all continuous, right? Spinal cord to the brainstem. And then you have a couple of different regions. The brainstem I'm not showing here, but basically your diencephalon is this small area over here. And then you have the cerebrum, right? That big wrinkly area, which is going to include some of these internal spaces, internal cavities right here. All right, but this is a sagittal section. We'll have a lot of these for your practical pictures to identify the particular structures and different views of this. All right, so what we'll talk about today is some of the regions, and in particular, just today, we're just going to focus on the cerebrum, cerebellum, and the diencephalon. These areas, like I said, we're going to skip. We talked about the spinal cord before. We're going to skip in between the spinal cord and the diencephalon, right? Because this will be more associated over here with your autonomic nervous system. So it'll be a nice kind of segue into your autonomic nervous system. But here we're going to just skip right above this. This is kind of like your lizard brain, your zombie brain that does like all these automatic functions. This is your big human brain and its associated parts right here, right? And the cerebellum we'll add in there just because it doesn't quite fit into that. All right, so, you know, when we're going over this, remind you, if it seems overwhelming, a lot of it, you know, if you wanted to, if you couldn't study it all and you could know this sheet, you know, that would go like at least 75% of the way of what you have to know, you know, for the exam. So it's, you know, I go over it kind of slowly and break it down and talk a little bit about context here, but this is basically a lot of the information you got to know. So we're going to start off, right? We had the spinal cord down over here. This laid into the brain stem, right? With the cerebellum back here, this most superior portion of the brain stem is called the midbrain, which we'll talk about next time. But sitting right on top of the midbrain over here, you start with your diencephalon, right? Which is going to be composed of the thalamus, right? In the middle, this is the main part, takes up the bulk of it actually. The hypothalamus, which is a major player in many systems that we talked about. And the hypothalamus, which I'll just briefly go over because it has this little pineal gland right here. And then the other thing connected to the hypothalamus, not really part of the brain per se, technically, is that pituitary gland, which we talked about during the endocrine system. That's connected to the diencephalon, although it's not. Actually, part of it is brain tissue. The posterior part is actually part of the diencephalon, but we'll just consider the hypothalamus, thalamus, and epithalamus as our diencephalon parts. All right, again, this is a sagittal section of the brain. All right. So for your diencephalon, you got these three, these regions, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pineal gland is going to be part of the epithalamus, right? Pituitary gland is going to be kind of connected to the hypothalamus. But this is your basic information about what is going on with your diencephalon. But we'll talk more in detail, especially about the thalamus today. And the hypothalamus we've covered a little bit before, and we'll cover more along with the brainstem and the autonomic nervous system, because that'll be a big function of that hypothalamus, right? But it's really, it comes up, we already talked about it with the hormone, right? Your endocrine system. And we'll talk a lot about it during the autonomic nervous system lectures. And we'll kind of connect it today when we talked about the emotional brain, the hypothalamus, and how it's a key kind of output of your emotional brain. Right? So for this, right, your hypothalamus connected to the pituitary gland, and we talked about this already during our endocrine system lectures, right? It's the master regulator of the pituitary gland, which is the master regulator of the endocrine system, right? We had those releasing and inhibitory hormones controlling those anterior pituitary glands, which were controlling a lot of the other systems, right? And then we had, by itself, we had oxytocin, which is going to be a big one for when you talk about the reproductive system, and ADH, anti-diuretic hormone, which is a big one when you talk about the urinary system and blood pressure and stuff like that. So you're going to run into the hypothalamus again in Bio 145 because of these hormones right here via the posterior pituitary. Right, but we already kind of went over that. There's a couple of key nuclei. And again, when I say nuclei, we're talking about groups of neurons, cell bodies, and dendrites that have a common function. And usually within the nervous system, what that means is there's a common input and a common output, right? It's getting information from, key places, and its output is to a common place, especially the output, right? So as far as like what it's doing, that's kind of what you want to look at. Who's talking to it? Who's it talking to? Right? And then what's it controlling? In this case, these ones will be releasing these releasing inhibitory hormones, releasing hormones to control this. These would be actually secreting hormones themselves. Right? That's part of the hypothalamus. And then the other part of the hypothalamus, which we'll talk about in the next couple of lectures, is that master regulator of the autonomic nervous system. So this little piece of tissue here, little groups of cells right here are going to have a huge influence. Right? And then the other thing which I'll mention today is there's this other little group of cells right here that are going to actually get some visual input from the eye. That is some of the light signals that are coming from the retina are going to be directed onto the cells over here. And what that's going to do is kind of go back. These cells are going to receive that light and go and connect to the pineal gland, right, which is in the back of the epithalamus. So what this does is really are regulating your what? Anybody know what this means? These circadian rhythms, the circadian rhythms. I'm drawing blanks all over. Circadian rhythms, right? That means your daily and nightly cycles, right? Things you do, how aroused you are during the day, like how awake you are, how sleepy you are, and really other kind of subtle stuff that you may not be aware of, right? But basically that suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus projects over to the pineal gland. And how many people just thought of that Mary Poppins song, supercalifragilisticexpialidocious? I'm sure that's where they got those words from. Suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus projects over to the pineal gland, and it stimulates it, to release melatonin. Or actually, I think it actually stops it from secreting melatonin. When there's light, or light inhibits or something like that, it controls it in some way. Let's see, there's more melatonin. It doesn't say right here. Don't worry about it. It's controlling it in some way. In any case, during the night, as it gets darker, in one way or another, the melatonin is being secreted like this. And this is going to be, supplied with, this is part of the endocrine system. Melatonin is a hormone. There'll be blood vessels running through here. The hormones will be secreted into the blood, and then they'll do, in a way we don't understand as far as this class goes, it's going to promote sleepiness. So, we can do that. You can buy melatonin as a supplement, and it also kind of helps regulate your body clock, right? Help you like your wake sleep cycles. All right, but so when we talk about the hypothalamus, I'm really the only thing we're concerned about is this pineal gland, pituitary glands up there. All right, so that's your epithalamus and the pineal gland right here. All right, so next we go on to the thalamus. Right, in the thalamus, notice, here's the brainstem, midbrain. Here's the thalamus. Here's your big brain, the cerebrum. Notice it's right in the middle, right? It's a paired structure. Everything we talk about almost. Actually, I take that back. This structure right here is it does not have a left and a right. Everything else, almost everything else we're going to talk about has a left and a right, right? A left and right thalamus, left and right hypothalamus. Your pineal gland is a singular organ, which is why way back in like the 1600s or whatever, when they were trying to figure out the brain's interaction, they thought it was the seat of the soul, but it wasn't, turns out. In any case, that just reminded me of this, that your thalamus, you have a left and right thalamus on either side, right? Sitting like right at the interface between all this incoming information coming from all over the body, right? Coming from up here, coming from your eyeballs, coming from your ear, right? Coming from all over. And this way, it's going to get all this information and project it to a particular place, right? It's also going to kind of connect different regions of the brain with that. It's going to connect different regions of the brain with this, right? It's this big major hub of interplace that's going to pass on information from one place to another. It's just this little thing. And what we're going to talk about it is this relay of sensory information. But you should kind of get the picture, or at least it's interesting to know that, you could basically take a whole course on the thalamus. You could spend your whole life studying a small little nuclei of the thalamus. You could, fill a library with what's going on right here. But for us, we're just going to look at it as a kind of a sensory relay part, right? And we already talked about that a little bit when we talked about the sensory pathway. We talked about that touch perception coming in from sensory neurons. And they were going in through your dorsal root ganglia, through the dorsal root, up those dorsal columns. And then they synapsed in the brainstem at one spot. And again, this was an area where we can amplify or kind of tone down the signal. And then we went up to the thalamus, right? We crossed over, went up to the thalamus on the other side of the body. And then, right, from the thalamus over here, again, we're going to project over to the cerebrum, right? A particular region of the cerebral cortex. So the reason we said that this is happening is because it gives us a chance to kind of filter that information. We don't need to know every single bit of information that's being sensed by the body, right? There's impulses coming all over your body that if you choose to focus right now, again, on the pressure at the bottom of your foot or the back of your thigh or something like that, or a sound like the barking dogs in my background right there, if you want to think of anything like that, right? You could focus on it. Or dropping spoons, right? Anything like that, right? You could hear it and focus on it, whereas otherwise you might have been entranced by the deep interest you have in whatever I was saying right here, right? But otherwise, you can kind of focus stuff, and then that information will kind of be amplified, and because your attention is on it, right? And the thalamus is going to do that for you. So, you know, before light is going back to your eyeball right here, right, in a weird way, which we'll talk about when we talk about the visual pathway. We're going to see that it's going to go first.
18 hours.
It's not only this information from your body, right, down below, all the skin and stuff, but it's your visual information is going to go through the thalamus, right, and then be projected into the visual region of your brain, right? So the thalamus, again, sitting right on top of the brainstem right here, has all sorts of different particular nuclei that is getting information from a certain place and passing it to a certain place. So the examples here are going to be this nucleus. This is like two of the ones that I might ask about in a test, right? The lateral geniculate nucleus. And the optic nerve is going to come in and synapse with a neuron in the lateral geniculate nucleus. And from there, it's going to project over to these higher order visual processing centers in your cerebral cortex.
Hey, Professor.
Yeah.
I know this is kind of unrelated, but isn't what was it called? The lobotomies, like related to the thalamus?
The lobotomies were usually done in your prefrontal lobe, and they were really to like knock out the connections between your emotional kind of aspects of your brain that you know they thought were going a little wild or something. So they kind of just shoved a screwdriver and ice picked in there, and they like mangled up all the connections, and then the person was based. But the thalamus wasn't. I don't think the thalamus was particularly, unless they might have got certain connections from going from that, you know, certain parts of the brain to there.
Okay.
It was they called it like a prefrontal lobotomy that referred to the prefrontal lobes.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. Thank you.
Anytime you got a question about lobotomies, I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. So in any case, in this case, this was going in, and you're maybe thinking of it because they did shove it through the like back of the skull, through the eye socket, but you know, it was centered, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on.
I just remember like maybe some of them had gone wrong and had affected the thalamus, and people had experienced.
Sure, I'm sure it easily could. I mean, it was a pretty brutal thing, you know, that they did. They literally shoved an ice pick in their head, and just wiggled it around and stuff. So that was the good old days of psychiatry.
Yeah, definitely not legal anymore.
Although they do have like electroconvulsive therapy, which is kind of a modern day lobotomy. In any case, we'll actually kind of cover something related to that a little later. But so for this is purely sensory information, like light signals hitting back and going up your optic nerve and passing over, eventually relaying, and again, filtering, right, for, you know, stuff maybe we're more interested and focused on for whatever reason. And then from your cochlea, we remember those sensory neurons that were picking up the stuff off the basilar membrane, and they're going to go into the medial geniculate nucleus over here, connect with the neuron over there, and that's going to be projecting to higher order auditory processing centers, right? So again, it's kind of weird. These are light signals. These are sound waves, right? But they were transduced into electric signals, and they're transduced, and they're just sent to a particular area. And all those electrical signals are interpreted as like a visual kind of sensation or perception. And all these electrical signals are going to be kind of constructed as auditory perceptions. But it's all electrical signals bouncing around your brain. That's two areas of your thalamus, right? Just redirecting these signals to the appropriate part of the brain. And really importantly, it's filtering. So really, don't worry about all the details here, right? You will not be responsible for these except those last two I just mentioned right there. But I want to kind of point out, right, that, you know, the reason that your brain can think, okay, I want to focus on the back of my thigh right now and feel, you know, feels a lot of pressure on it now that he mentioned it, is because your brain is, you know, other parts of your brain can go and talk to it and say, okay, focus on the back of the thigh or something, or do something like that, or look out, be on the lookout for a snake in the pathway or something like that, right? So all your parts of the brain are kind of going through the thalamus. Almost all your parts of your brain are talking through the thalamus in these things. And so major relay station for not only the primary sensory, which we're going to be focused on, because in your TEAS exams and stuff, they usually kind of say relay center for sensory information is what your, you know, your kind of very basic function of your thalamus is. But it's relaying all sorts of stuff because it's the central part of the brain, right in the middle of it all. That's the thalamus, right? And so this brings us into those regions of the brain that it's projecting to.